Ma'am, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, as I was saying the instructions, kindly keep your microphones and your videos turned off throughout the program. There is no attendance sheet for those on the meeting platform as it is automatically generated. However, those on YouTube need to fill the attendance link which will be sent in the chat box. If you are having trouble viewing the program on the Cisco WebEx, kindly use the YouTube link which will be put up in the chat box. If you have any queries, please put them in the chat box. I repeat, please keep your microphones and your videos turned on. We have with us Mr. Hafiz Amirul, who is heading the strategic planning and building resilient communities at Mercy, Malaysia. He teaches urban theory at the University Technology Mara at Malaysia. He is also the network coordinator for Asia Disaster Reduction and Response Network. Today he will talk on strategic decision making during emergency situations. I would like to give a few instructions to the speakers as well. Kindly stick to the time allotted for you. If you have any technical issues, please turn off your video and speak with your presentation on the screen. Mr. Hafiz, over to you.
Well, thanks, Florence. Good morning, everyone. For those in your time zone, good afternoon for those in my time zone. So today, thank you, Florence, for the short and brief introduction. So I was given the topic on strategic decision making during emergency situations, but then I have decided to add in an additional word on strategic planning and decision making during emergency situation, because I think that is more more spot on to deal with emergency situations. Okay, let me start here. Can everyone see my screen? Maybe Florence, I just would like to check with you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see your screen, sir.
Excellent. Okay. So before we get into the detail of strategic planning and decision making in response or emergency response, well, the overview that we need to understand, the underlying principle or spirit of this whole humanitarian action is the humanitarian project cycle, or HRP in short. Sorry, HPC in short. So it includes the basic cycle of work processes. I mean, this is nothing new. I'm assuming that everyone is familiar with this. Needs assessment and analysis, and then the strategic planning and resource mobilization, which later during the implementation of your programs and projects will also require monitoring to ensure that the assistance or the humanitarian aid given is properly targeted and benefiting the recipients, and finally evaluation for improvement purposes. But since the time limit is only 20 minutes, so let's stick to one phase of the cycle, which is strategic planning. While we talk about strategic planning, at least for me, one of the most important, or if not the most important, is coordination. Yeah. So we need to ask regularly, constantly, who are the actors, who are the people that we are going to work with, who are our partners, and so on. Who, and then what, and then where, when, and how. I mean, the usual 4W and 1H. So these are the questions that will lead us to keep on giving or putting up correct question in hope that we can arrive at the correct answer. And those questions are guided by the three main activities or phases in any humanitarian action, which is preparedness, response, and recovery. Well, some people would like to put preparedness as a later stage, but I think after working in the humanitarian sector for so long, preparedness should come first. I mean, that's the whole idea about being prepared and readiness. I mean, it contradicts the idea of being prepared if it is put at the last phase. So by having the understanding, or by constantly being reminded to ask these 5 main questions within the 3 main phases or activities, will put us into a more technical or operational coordination mechanism. Again, this is nothing new. It has been practiced internationally and nationally throughout many experiences of different disaster or emergency situations worldwide, where there's a national level coordination, which is coordinated by the national government. And if the crisis or disaster supersedes of any scale, for example, a level 3 disaster where international assistance is required, then it requires international level coordination, where usually the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs will sometimes take lead or sometimes support the national government. Okay, so those are the 2 areas: the national level coordination, which is very important because we are working in a particular country, and then there's the international level coordination, where we work with multiple agencies, multi or bilateral organizations, yeah, the donors, the private sector, and also the media, especially in this current age of communication, of social media, of post-truth information sharing. Media is very important. So that is the framework of coordination. And to get things more coordinated, especially this is the cluster approach, which is quite common to be used at an international level. And I believe most countries are also adopting the similar cluster approach in their own national disaster management. The whole philosophy of this cluster approach is to get things well coordinated. If you take, for example, the Indian Ocean tsunami in Chennai, it is one of the biggest disaster that happened in the modern history of mankind. And for those who have experienced a response during that time, it was a massive response. So therefore, it provided us some avenue, some platform to improve. Therefore, the cluster approach was slowly developed, and now it is in this form that appears on the screen. Yeah. So each sector, each essential sectors have a leading cluster lead, which then will work in each clusters in a coordinated manner. So that's the cluster approach. And this cluster approach also covers the whole phases of prevention, mitigation, preparedness, the response phase itself, recovery, reconstruction, and it goes back to prevention, mitigation, and so on. So it's a very complete cycle of not only coordination, but the whole implementation of the whole process. So coordination alone is not enough. I mean, the many agencies, be it the international agencies or the national agencies, are often criticized of only doing coordination and talks, but without proper implementation. And the key to proper implementation, so that we can at least provide meaningful assistance, is through coordinated needs assessment. So assessment is key because, well, basically the way humanitarian agencies function is that it is binded by the principle of humanitarian, the humanitarian principles and the humanitarian code of conduct. And one of it is impartiality, where we should respond based on needs alone. So therefore, in this very simplified diagram, we can see the phases of actions, yeah, and how to do it. And in most disaster situation, you can't escape the fact that ad hoc needs assessments are required because of the situation, because of the emergency situation. But then things should improve So from the needs, from data collection, from the sanitized data from needs assessment, will eventually brings you to the uh, uh, to the uh, to the next step of making decisions, of making strategic plans. Um, so to summarize all of those process, it goes back to preparedness. Preparedness in terms of well, basically everything. But I mean, again, just to stay focused within the discussion of today's presentation, I'll just stick on to response planning preparedness. Yeah. So if you can connect the dots, so from coordination to needs assessment, so these are the things that we need to prepare. We need to have the capacity in terms of human resources, in terms of infrastructure and facilities, in terms of understanding on disaster impact information. So how quick and how accurate can we get information of disaster that impacts a certain population, districts, country, or even a region, yeah? And how can we become more prepared in conducting needs analysis? And one of the way, because I mean humanitarian action or response require timely action, is to partner. Because I mean traveling will take time. What more in the current COVID-19 situation where traveling is almost impossible. Therefore, one of the way to do timely needs analysis is by having a strong partner in many countries, in many places. Yeah, and we also have to keep on improve our preparedness in terms of response capacity by doing regularly a response capacity analysis. Yeah, we got to understand our capacity, um, our modalities of doing things, and the whole mechanism of coordination and having a proper roster. So these are all preparedness before any disaster happen. And I strongly encourage any organizations, any institution to keep on doing this preparedness activities. Um, and to complement all of those are basically planning, training, and advocacy. So we keep on doing these three things continuously so that our response planning preparedness can be sharpened and can be improved from day to day. So just to simplify, what are those four main components that I was talking to? I tried to put it in a very simple step by step. Okay, this is just a proposition, just an idea. It is not cast in stone. It is not legally binding. It doesn't mean that this is the best way of doing things. Yeah, but at least from my work experience, these are the 6 steps that I usually follow. Yeah. So before we can develop the strategic plan of an emergency response, we need to institutionalize disaster planning. Institutionalize meaning that your disaster planning should be shared across organizations, within your organizations, and also across relevant stakeholders in your own community and within your own country, and of course within the region and global networks and partners. Yeah. Number 2 is to continuously um, improve our hazard vulnerability capacity and risk analysis ability. So the human resources, the facility, the infrastructure within our organization should be able to conduct this hazard vulnerability capacity and risk analysis correctly and in a timely manner. Step number 3 is on resource identification and mobilization. We need to update, we need to recognize, identify, and always aware what are our resources, be it funding, be it human resource, be it technological resource. Step number 4, early warning, alert systems and triggers. So this doesn't mean that it has to be technologically driven. It doesn't mean that it has to be expensive. Yeah, it can also be driven by a very local, low technology indigenous way of doing things, and by saying that, it relates to resource identification, it relates to coordination, it relates to communication, and most importantly, it relates back to engagement with partners, with communities, and so on. Yeah, and of course with academic institutions. Step number 5 is communications and networks, because without communications, without a proper channel, coordination is almost impossible. And not only coordination, as we are experiencing in the post-truth world, where this new term information pandemic, yeah, where rumors and fake news travels faster than viruses, yeah. So communications and networks are very important. And to understand sectoral responsibilities, well, basically step number 6 is about coordination. By understanding sectoral responsibilities, we'll translate the understanding of responsibilities to be carried by each organizations, by each personnel, by each agencies. Yeah. So these 6 steps are, at least for me, are the most important in before we develop the strategic plan for a disaster response. So just a quick case study. So when COVID-19 start to spread in Malaysia, I'm just talking in the context of Malaysia. The government of Malaysia was pretty quick to announce the movement control order, or lockdown, or circuit breaker, as it's known in Singapore, on the 18th of March. So our first version of strategic preparedness and response plan for COVID-19 was released on the 19th of March. So that's very quick. That doesn't mean that we work on it on the 18th of March. We have anticipated this. We worked closely with the Ministry of Health. We work closely with other agencies and organizations, and more or less the whole process before we publish or we use our strategic preparedness and response plan was about 2 weeks before. So that's the whole process, and this was made possible by that whole 6 steps that I explained earlier. Yeah. And strategic response plan or preparedness and response plan doesn't mean that it is something that is very rigid. Yeah. So for example, the first version of Mercy Malaysia's plan was launched on 19th of March, and the second version, the revised version, was officially used by the 15th of April. Now, why this happened? Because in any situation, be it emergency or non-emergency, I mean, situations are fluid, are very dynamic. There are many external and internal factors that will influence, that will affect how the situation changes. Yeah. So by that, of course, our plans should also be flexible enough to accommodate or to suit itself with current context and situations. And of course, through the whole cycle of disaster risk management, there's the next step, which now Malaysia is experiencing, is the recovery phase. So we have also start to use our recovery plan, which is a transition and an intermediary exit strategy for our COVID-19 situation. So that was launched on the 15th of June and is being used until today. So for those who are interested to have a look, you can just scan the QR code there, and it will land you in the website to these documents. So my last slide is on monitoring. Yeah. So the only way of management or of evaluating our the effectiveness of our strategic plan and decisions are by tracking what we call as plan versus actual delivery. So all those plan delivery are documented in the strategic plan, on the strategic decisions, and all those decisions will be reflected in the actual delivery. And this is very important, not only for the sake of evaluation, but also to be transparent, to be accountable. So for Mercy Malaysia, we are using technology. We update it on a daily basis, lifetime. What do you call this? Real time basis. Or what are the delivery, and people can see, access this information, and track it to understand how the strategic plan is functioning and how we as an organization is accountable to all the funding and donation that we receive. So if you want to learn more about this, there's a link there, mercyfightscovid19.com, to have a look. I think that's all from me. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for sharing with us how your country has also been tackling this pandemic. Now, before we move on to the next speaker, I would like to repeat the instructions that we have. Participants, please put only your questions in the chat box. Please don't spam it. And also, I request you to keep your microphones and your videos turned off throughout the program. There is no attendance sheet required for those on the meeting platform, as it is automatically generated, but those on YouTube will need to fill it. Next, we have with us Dr. Valentine Joseph Gandhi. Dr. Valentine Joseph Gandhi is a senior evaluation, innovation, and tech for good specialist with over 18 years of interdisciplinary experience at both field and policy level. He is also the founder of the think tank, the Development Cafe, and the co-founder of the Madras Data Futures Hub. He is currently the Chief of Party for USAID of Indonesia's Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Support Program for Social Impact. He will talk to us on combating fake news during crisis and disaster. Over to you, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Hear you, sir.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for MCC and the National Disaster Management Agency for this opportunity. And greetings very much from Jakarta, Indonesia. And I hope all of you are keeping safe in these times of the pandemic. So my topic today is something we deal with on a daily basis, especially since a lot of our work revolves around crisis and disaster management, of which pandemic for sure is one such worthy inclusion. So I'm going to talk about how some of us in our jobs, we deal with fake news, which is a pandemic of its own, to be honest, given the impact it has. So I'm not going to give you too much details, but generally walk through some of the strategies that exist out there, especially in international development, on how we combat fake news and what causes fake news to spread so fast. So you might have seen a lot of fake news on a daily basis. Sometimes it looks very legitimate, and sometimes it looks like, oh wow, this can't be true, or this can't be false, and we tend to spread. But what is true is fake news causes a lot of instability. It causes a lot of chaos. It's like the more of a digital terrorism in some ways people are putting it, and it puts lives, property, and people's responses at stake, given the nature of it. And they range from a very harmless, funny forward you might see in WhatsApp or Facebook to very serious things that can actually make or break our nation. So it's a different range, and all of us, given the social media situation, are being victims of either reading fake news or sometimes by mistake even forwarding fake news because we think it's real or we think it's in line with our thinking at best. But what is an established fact is, in terms of crisis and disaster management, whether it's a pandemic or earthquake or volcanoes, I mean, I live in Indonesia, which is a country surrounded by natural disasters, earthquakes and volcanoes. Is almost every week we have something. So this kind of response from a government agency or an NGO agency can be terrible when you are confronted with this fake news, because it impedes any action that governments or agencies can take. So why do we believe in fake news or in conspiracy theories and propaganda? Even though sometimes it looks like, oh no, this is so strange, how can it be true? Or why is a particular news more appealing to some and not appealing to others? It has several factors, but psychologists and psychology today lists around 10 factors, but I've chosen 3 of which we all can relate to. And sometimes these are used for situations like buying I mean, if I'm Googling about, like I used to like motorcycles a lot. So if I'm Googling in my phone about motorcycles, the next second I get a lot of ads on motorcycles, even though I might have just typed once. And if I open my Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, suddenly I see a lot of ads on motorcycles. And the scary part is sometimes I don't even have to type it. Somebody in my vicinity, it could be my family member or my colleague in the place that I work, if they are searching for something, any phone that is nearby will send similar ads, because these tech companies are using this to target their marketing customers. But in that case, it's okay, only a business model, a way to reach your customers. But that is the same which has an ugly other side, where the same principle is used by people who spread false and misinformation. But why do we believe it? Because some of these news confirms our existing bias. If you see somebody translating a extreme view on a particular religion, and you or I already hold that extreme view, we will simply believe it or want to believe it to be true, because that is our mindset. And sometimes translation of these fake news very fast is because a lot of us actually believe them or want them to be true. It could be, I don't want to take specific examples, but I'm sure you all understand what I'm talking about. Like if you take for in the US, there are certain sections of people who think black people are supposed to be inferior. And if you share false news that a black guy or an Afro-American person had robbed a store, even though if it's fake, they will immediately transfer it, because their mind, they think African Americans are robbers or something like that. Pre-confirmed bias. So when you see a nose, this can be applied to all walks of our belief system. It can be not just about what we think about people or other human beings, even our own religion. Sometimes our religions make us to be, what do you say, they have a certain belief system, and when there is a news about the belief system, even though it may not be true, they will say and forward it because it confirms the bias. And that's one of the dangerous factors. That's why we believe or we transmit fake news. The second one is, as I mentioned, if I'm searching for mobile phones or if I'm searching for motorbikes, there is emotions are target. As Indians, I mean, as you can see, I'm very much an Indian, so we are generally emotional people. Even though sometimes when I grew up in Chennai, even though I used to be surprised when somebody says something about a movie star they like, people get really angry. Oh, how can you say about my Talewa or whatever like that? Even though never in his life this person would have met the actor, or the actor even knows of his existence, but they take it so personally, because generally we are very emotional people. It's not just Indians per se. Human beings are generally very emotional. Maybe the level of emotions differ from countries, but so these fake news also target our emotions again. And the last one is the illusory truth effect. Illusory truth effect is when you constantly repeat a news. There is a couple of TV channels in India where you will see, or in most channels in India, they see breaking news and they'll keep flashing the news. Oh, this is what is happening. Oh, what will I do today? What will I do tomorrow? What is the situation in China? They will keep flashing it. Sometimes it is truthful and sometimes it is not. But even that illusory truth effect of constantly feeding into your brain eventually starts to just process it as true, even if it is false. So, and the last one, this quote by Lemony Snicket, who was a popular author, is, the sad truth is sad. Why do we worship movie stars? Why do we like Avengers, Spider-Man, or Rajinikanth so much, even though sometimes what they show in television or in the movies is so much non-realistic or fantastical? Because our lives are sometimes just normal, and we want to live the non-normal, fantastical things. That's why we are drawn to things that are not truthful, but at least it is better than our realities. And that is true. Sometimes truth is sad. It's a reality that faces you in times of conflict, or in times of your daily 9-to-5 job, or if you're a poor person working in a difficult situation, or if you're stressed. It doesn't matter if you're poor or rich. I mean, if you're stressed, you just want some escapism from that. And that's why truth or reality is sad. And so we often tend to be drawn towards fake news. These are the reasons fake news is spread, according to psychologists. And the problem for disaster management as agencies, whether you are a government agency or a donor, or like the Mercy that the gentleman before me spoke, agencies like that, the biggest challenge public safety agencies and organizations face is to reduce and eliminate the spread of false information, especially as public demands for response from these authorities increase. So if you see this poster, this newspaper article, it's an article from front page article from 1943, where they're talking about how dinosaurs, Nazis are having dinosaurs, and how people were attacking, and just to create this news was generated by the Nazi regime to influence the morale of the Allied forces, to make them believe that they cannot win this war. So it's not new phenomena. It's just that it has become more spread because of the power of the internet and social media. But fake news has existed as long as there was news. So the problem these agencies face is when they are dealing with a real crisis like corona or natural disasters or rainfall or flooding, and then they're trying to sort and plan a strategy or a response mechanism. Their big block is from people is to, when they created fear, and it becomes so difficult for challenges to be addressed, because people don't want to listen to legitimate sources because they are masked by all this number of fake sources. And because social media can distribute news faster to a wider audience, this has become a lot more issue. A factor that may also impede first responders. Who are first responders when there's a crisis, when there's a fire, or when there's an earthquake? The people who first come to the region are the first responders. It could be policemen, it could be firefighters, and so on and so forth. But increasingly, fake news will cause trouble for first responders to reach people on time. And the loss could be more because of fake news, as opposed to if there was legitimate information being transferred. And then how do we spot fake news? When you see a quick article being sent in your WhatsApp, it may confirm your bias. But we are all professionals here in various different situations of disaster management or risk, or professors or students or social workers. So how do we spot this? Do we also send like an average person, oh, I see this, yeah, see, my religion is saying this is correct, so this news has to be correct, or my belief system, we immediately transfer. But as professionals, we need to take a step back and consider the source and start to have a little bit of critical thinking on where did this story come from? This looks a little bit suspicious to me. And when you see a headline, just don't forward it. Read beyond the headlines. Most often agencies spread only the headline, but the content will be nothing like the headline. And then check the author. Does the author have a bias, or is it a legitimate author? Internet can be anybody. So just check and support the right sources, check the date, and see. Sometimes there are satirical sites which present news as if real. And I've seen many times leaders in many countries share satirical or joke sites as real news. So you should check. And your own bias. I mean, as an average person, we can't expect them to not to have bias. But as professionals dealing with disaster management or social work or working with humanitarian crisis, we need to constantly check our bias. Am I thinking about this news because of the way I am or because of my religion, or is it because it's factual? And then if you still can't, you can always ask experts or check a legitimate government source or other sources that are legitimate. This is how you spot fake news. But how do we address those fake news? Once you are in a disaster situation and you see fake news spreading, we need to get to the root of the problem. That is how we have to reduce it systematically. What are the causes of disinformation? Why is it rumor spreading in Chennai? Or why is rumor spreading in Maharashtra, or wherever it is that you're dealing with? And how does this information spread in this question? And thirdly, what are the best practices in that situation? These are, again, as I said, more general overview on what is needed to look at. But every situation can be different. I mean, North India may be different from South India because of cultural regions, or Indonesia may be different from Malaysia and things like that. So while there are general guidelines, you still need to have specific best practices to counter. So I've put together a few things that you can do when you're combating fake news. Again, these are causes that I already reinstated. Causes are misinformation, incorrect information, insufficient information, and opportunistic disinformation. Opportunistic disinformation you can see a lot by people who have political interests. They always try to send selected information or outdated information. Somebody must have done something when they are in a different party or something, and they will use it sometimes to against the news. And incorrect information, intentional versus unintentional. Incorrect information is when you falsely spread wrong information to malign somebody or to prevent some activity being given or some benefit being given to a group of people. Now, I was talking about best practices. So the people, as you are a government agency or an NGO or something, you should start working with the people first, the best practices, engaging local television, radio, news media to disseminate useful information, connect with the right partners. Again, it doesn't mean local television and radio are all perfect people. There are also vested interests, and as we all know, people who are biased, but we need to identify and leverage right people who are more neutral. It's easy. There are a lot of studies that have been done to show who are more likely to lean towards false information and who are not. So as a government agency, you should be neutral in that, or as a NGO working with the right sources. So engage the right people and constantly build awareness and relationships to ensure only the right news is spread. And secondly, crowdsourcing and influencers are a big news source now. I mean, if you are a millennial or someone born after the 90s, you may have Instagrams or Twitter, and a lot of people get their news from that. So you need to identify who are these top influencers in your city or in your state and help them to spread this news. In Indonesia, we have a lot of actors, actresses being used by the National Disaster Management Agency here to spread information on the right information on coronavirus, and it spread because people panic about that. And there was news immediately about some zombies being affected because of coronavirus, which was a big scare. And then eventually a couple of actors were brought in to show that that is actually a news clip from a movie called Legend by Will Smith. So things can be immediately diffused if you use the right people. And then train and exercise first responders, people who are in the field facing the disaster, facing the people, facing the situation. They should be trained as well. They shouldn't be just sent, because if you send a first responder to face the crowd which is facing a disaster, and they don't know whether it's false news or true, they will actually make the situation worse. So best practices first is to deal with the right, engaging the right people. Next is the processes. Create a joint information system, whether at a state level or a regional level. Create a joint information system. The last colleague who spoke had a lot of systems on how to systematically synthesize and build a strategy. So create, it can be a virtual one, it can be a radio one, it can be an online one. Create this joint information system so public information can be coordinated across agencies, whether it's non-profit or profit or companies. You ensure that there is one coordinated center which acts as a legitimate source. For coronavirus, a lot of us use WHO or Johns Hopkins. Both of them are legitimate sources, but that's a joint information center. And then we again take some data from that and map out individually across countries how does it work. And then prepare pre-scripted messages which are targeting specific place disaster agency, because many times fake news experts are ones who are very good in using hashtags, and hashtags help web crawlers and other social media tools to spread the news faster. So as a government agency, you should fight fire with fire. As an NGO, you should fight with fire with fire. So you should create scripted messages which highlight legitimate news sources. And then prepare draft visuals, graphics, photos, and videos, potential disaster scenarios, and archive this so they are rapidly accessible. You'll be surprised to know the number of people working on fake news have so much skilled professionals working for them. So they designed this legitimate looking false news. So in order to counter them, we should be able to invest in news items. Otherwise, whatever plans we do as an agency can fall flat if people don't believe you or think does not believe in the right news. The last one I want to talk about in best practices is technology. A central website for any disaster is useful. I mean, I know there is National Disaster Agency's own website, and they have created one for coronavirus. And for coronavirus, for example, they have a lot of portals. In Indonesia, there are specific portals for specific regions for volcanoes. In the US, they have specific for forest fires. In Australia, they have for forest fires. So have a central website which is legitimate, which has a secure. Sometimes I'm surprised to see government agencies not having the secure logo, because it just costs a little bit extra to get that secure logo. So your website doesn't start with just HTTP, but has HTTPS and has a lock symbol. So you can create that central website, and tweet hyperlinks and sample tweets can be used to counter mass spread of false information with mass spread of correct information, thereby debunking the existing spread of false information. But there are still challenges with regards to fighting fake news, because there are still legal issues when you spread information fast, because many people are afraid, especially in the US, for instance. If you say something is fake news, they will sue you saying, no, this is not fake news, this is what I believe in. In India, it's not so much, and Indonesia is not so much. You can actually fight news without the problem of having legal issues. But in many countries, legally combating fake news is not a institutionalized system yet. And lack of buy-in. Sometimes maybe you are the only one concerned with fake news, or a few of the agencies are concerned, but some of them are not worried about it. They actually want the fake news to spread, so they have their political motives or situations improve. So lack of buy-in is a problem. And privacy is sometimes when you share news about a situation where we can have, if you're taking an aerial photograph of a slum or a flooded area, people may be concerned that you're taking photographs of themselves in distress. I mean, all of us want to be presented nicely, even in disaster. I don't want to be seen in a disaster situation. But sometimes if you see newspaper, they keep highlighting people are already in pain, but they keep highlighting. So how do you feel right now? You just had an earthquake, or your somebody had an accident in your family. What do you think? And they keep pushing them. Recently, an actor died in India, Mr. Rajput, and his family was hounded by news media. So there's no privacy. They're already dealing with laws. And then you highlight. So when you deal with fake news, countering fake news also, you need to consider privacy factors. And funding. Unfortunately, except the tech giants, which like Google and Facebook, there are not many funding, especially for combating fake news, as much as there is for other issues, largely because there is a big lobby on promoting fake news around the world, and they keep fighting. But government agencies and donors are waking up to the challenges of fake news, and there is increase in funding both at government and private levels, and so hopefully these can be shared. In India, there is no specific law on fake news per se, but these are some of the sections on the Indian Penal Code and the Disaster Management Act and Information Technology Act, which are generally used to combat fake news. And I'm sure my colleagues at the Disaster Management Agency know this better, especially during coronavirus situation. These were again invoked to prevent spread of misinformation about any lockdown issues or others that are coming up. So there is provisions in the Indian Penal Code, but nothing specific. But at the same time, all of these laws exist for sure. Laws have been existing. But ultimately, it's up to us as individuals to combat fake news. It's every individual's responsibility, because you can have a great plan, you can have a strategy. One of the things that I'm engaged now is called political economy analysis, where you can design an intervention that is technically sound, but if you don't understand the cultural and political context in which that intervention is introduced, or in this case, a disaster is being averted, then fake news will spread very fast. So that's why, even though you may have laws, you may have a lot of strategies to plan, ultimately it's all of us to check our own biases, our own forwards. Don't forward before you know what it is for, whether it's helping out, especially if you're a government agency or an NGO person, then you need to be more responsible than an average individual into combating fake news. So that's it. I mean, this is something I wanted to reiterate. Consider the source, read beyond, check the author, support the sources, check the date, see if it's a parody or a joke. Check your own biases, which is very important because our bias lead to transferring of false information fast. And then ask the experts and ensure that fake news is not preventing hard work done by agencies like Disaster Management Agency and other NGOs to combat natural disasters. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, sir. We have a few questions. The first question is how media content should be checked and filtered. Because talking about local communities, they do believe what media says and flashes ads, breaking news.
That's why I said we have legal issues to block on someone, right? In the internet, anyone can post anything. It's not like those days where there is a hard copy newspaper and then you can challenge the author and the next day they will come up and say, sorry, I made a mistake. But today news spreads so fast. I mean, I didn't have time to put a lot of examples of how fast fake news spreads. So we can't really filter what's out there. But two things is legally we can step to ensure that even before media fake news spreads, the government agencies and NGOs and other private sector work together to put out the right information. So people are aware at all levels. Nearly everyone has a mobile phone, at least a SMS receiving phone. So use those resources to send the right WhatsApp, for example, write the right messaging. But after it's out there, send countering mechanisms. And third is the punitive action where you use laws to block and stop. With posting something immediately, we can't immediately stop because it's the internet. But that's why if it's your own responsibilities, you make sure you are blocking and you're not sending your biases out. But if you see it outside, when a disaster strikes, set up this central database and make sure people are. And then there are three steps. One is the countering the false information with facts using a central database. The second is ensuring these fake news are censored. And third is taking punitive or punishment actions towards the people who spread that news. Any further questions?
Sir, I have another question.
Hear me, sir? Yeah. Is postmodernism also responsible for this post-truth era? That's the question.
I don't know what you mean by postmodernism in the context. I mean, are you suggesting like modern values? I would say, like I said, fake news is not a new phenomenon. I showed you the example from this, the Nazi propaganda newspaper. So fake news has always existed in one form or the other. But for sure, modern technology has enabled the spread pretty fast. So I don't know if it is philosophically the reason. And the reason why we believe in fake news that I listed about in terms of illusory truth effect or confirmation bias, these are things again existed as long as human beings have existed. Sometimes religion also uses the ability of influencing human beings to do certain things that are not originally meant in the texts, like suicide bombs or the Spanish Inquisition, and these kind of things in all religions exist. Violence. These are not originally in the propagated by the religion, but certain people use that to their advantage. So it's not really a postmodern phenomena, but the rate at which it spreads is certainly a modern phenomena, due to which it's more careful. We need to be more careful because of the power of the social media and internet.
Madam, unmute and talk.
So in this crisis that we are in, who controls the fake news? Sometimes even the government sections are responsible for spreading fake news? There's a question.
Yeah, it depends. In some countries, some governments employ people to ensure they are targeting. It's the new strategy. You don't need to actually go to war anymore. You just need to. When you say war, it's not like landing in the beaches of Normandy or a ship arriving in some port. Information or by digital terrorism or information warfare is what is the modern warfare. So people spread false information. I mean, recently they found that Twitter removed so many Russian bots or Chinese bots, and in the news there was one Indian company which was controlling 265 fake news sites to influence European Parliament decisions and things like that. So it is the new warfare, and so that is why we need to combat it. Fake news not only affects crisis and disaster, it affects all walks of our life, right from governance to politics to policy to religion and financial matters, and even able to influence stock market crashes and real estate and so on and so forth. So it is a serious problem which needs a serious solution. And that is why, as professionals, we need to be a little bit more awake. And I listed some ways you can combat fake news in that document. Feel free to share the PowerPoint with the colleagues. So yeah, that is a new warfare, and that's why we need to look at it like a warfare.
Is there any plagiarism like checkup, sir? We have a plagiarism software like that. Is there any checking measures?
So there are, like if you saw in my PowerPoint, let me try to share it again. The first slide is has as a news article. Let me share it again. Share content. So there are many websites like FactCheck, PolitiFact, and other technology science, and Google has a Google News initiative, which is brand new. These are the ones that are trying to combat fake news. So those are the sites that we can rely on. Can you see my slide?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see your
Yes.
slide.
I'm just expanding this. So this is a assessment of assessment of the mapping by this independent source on how news agencies in the US fare against liberal and conservative. So they have options on green rectangle, yellow, fair interpretation of the news, unfair interpretation of the news, nonsense, damaging to public discourse. So they rank them based on that, starting from who are the ones that are most legitimate, starting from here, Palmer Report and all that. And then they go up to InfoWars, which is a very fake news, which a lot of people in India also think is true. But and then Fox News falls somewhere between fair and unfair and things like that. So they have mapped it based on liberal and conservative and partisan bias, and some of them being neutral, saying they don't care about either this or that, but they are more on the progressive side. So this is trying to map more or less about liberal and conservative parties in the US. So like that, there are multiple sites around the world which fact check information. You can always post a link and say whether it's a fact, and they come up with news. I saw somebody typing that the CNN is fake news, blah blah. That is again a line pushed by fake news sites, because they want to paint anything that is true or against them as fake news. That is also a problem. Sometimes it's not really fake news, but because it challenges your own bias, you will immediately call it fake news. That's why I said one of the first ways to check fake news is to check your own bias. Are you saying this is fake news because of your own bias, or are you believing this to be true because of your bias? So it's okay for an average person to have biases, but if you're in disaster management and if you're a NGO head or something, then you should stop having, or at least try to fight your biases on a daily basis when you deal with national disasters, because what you think can impact a lot of people. Because if you think, no, these people don't deserve disaster risk management because of a news article you read, then you're going to ignore an entire section of people. So that is why this is something we have to fight on a daily basis.
Thank you so much, sir. We have one question. How does disaster response differ from the rural areas and the cities? Because even after so many measures, the team never reaches the needy. Mr. Hafiz?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question, very valid one. Because previously, or maybe until today, there's a structural failure in recognizing the importance of the urban and rural nexus. This means that there should be a very clear definition and understanding about the differences, the similarities and gaps, and also things that could complement the division between urban and rural. So as a practicing urban designer, the whole understanding of um, the the demographics, the whole situation of an urban context and rural context, whether it is infrastructural links, whether it is information and communication ability, um, that allows information to travel across urban and rural divide, needs to be um, rectified. And that's the reason why there is such a challenge in doing that. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to get the things right by really understanding the division, but at the same time acknowledge that that division or differences shouldn't be a gap. Any differences between urban and rural, whether it is capacities, whether it is challenges or problems, should be complementary to each other, if you get what I mean.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Hafiz and Dr. Valentine. We request the participants to please refrain from unmuting yourselves to ask questions. Please leave your questions in the chat box and the moderator will take it up. And please don't text anything in the chat box when the presenters are presenting. Karthik will take over from here.
Hello, am I audible, Florence?
Yes, Karthik, you're audible.
Thank you, Florence. Before moving on to the next part of the session, I would like to request the participants to kindly turn off their audio and their video to avoid technical difficulties. Also, I request them to put on their questions in the chat box, and it will be answered later by the speakers. Moving on to the next part of the program, we have Mr. T.T. Mayuran with us, who is going to share a case study on relief and rehabilitation during crisis. Mr. T.T. Mayuran is a child rights activist and a social work professional from Sri Lanka with over 15 years of field experience in social work, psychosocial interventions, community development, and the humanitarian response in disaster and post-war context. He is also the founder of Center for Children's Happiness in Sri Lanka, which has been functioning as a national non-profit organization since 2006. He has the exposure in same field in Africa, America, and other South Asian countries. Now I'd like to request Mr. T.T. Mayuran to take over the session. Hello, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can.
Mention the story Lanka, the history of disasters in the past, we had our own infrastructure and system in place, to face the disaster and to prepare the disaster. And there are late developments are in the way, like in the past 10 years, and a major disaster which was in 2004, the tsunami. So as I said, the stories from the we had in Sri Lanka in the past with in 2004. And as a country, as an island, like, how we responded to that disaster, and personally how I involved in it, and through my role, and I just wanted to share. And then the second one is the a man-made disaster, which is a civil war, so which started in 1983, to which the last war May. So the major one we undergone, a part of the country, mostly the northern, was experienced to the war, and we involved directly to deal with this war and the displacement and all the disaster, then recovery and the rehabilitation just after the war. The current issue, 20. So with these experiences and the learnings from the extinct disaster, how it is helping us to develop and deal with the current issues, like learning from the past, to deal with the future. So building back better in the recovery from this global pandemic is absolutely necessary to build more resilient society, health, disaster, including pandemic and epidemic. So mechanism and the system that we have formed in the past also is being supported. So that's what all the disasters and the experiences also a kind of learning for us to develop the system and to ensure the best practices. Sorry, I couldn't move.
I think on the left hand side, down bottom side, you can see the arrows, and I think it will work from there. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The slide has changed.
Then was in 2004, and just consider the last war, which was held in 2009, and then the current issue now with COVID-19. So in tsunami, I involved and I coordinated as a coordinator for task force in disaster. Basically, we were coordinating the mental health services in that time, and during that in the tsunami phase in northern Sri Lanka, we networked with NGOs. A lot of organizations were working with development and then humanitarian supports, but when the tsunami hit, then the organizations have to be coordinated and networked. So that was in that time, and then coordinated human resources. We had a lot of need to be connected with resources, especially the human resources. And we developed a capacity in mental health and psychosocial support services because we had a huge need on that during that time to get the resources and to work in the field in the coastal areas. And we also had organized befriending sessions and then capacity development. We also had published informations to the medias, because that era, we don't have the social medias are not active, and then sharing right information is an issue always in that time. And so we took an initiative to share the information, and we had the media briefs, and we have provided informations to the media to source, because these whatever the information shared to the people in that time. So needed interventions that we have taken. And then we had a volunteer management, and then we involved in assessment in order to share right informations and all. When we look at the last war in 9, which was a massive incident considered with all the incidences that we faced in the past. And I had a role in that time to manage the relief and rehabilitation response in an organization called Consortium of Humanitarian Organizations. So Consortium of Humanitarian Agencies is an umbrella body to network all the organizations in Sri Lanka, the nationals and the international organizations. So we facilitated relief support to the area where we had the mass displacement, and then we also involved in the cluster coordinations. Like we had different clusters, and the civil society organizations and the NGOs were very active by that time in order to identify the needs and to prepare the needs and response and to plan for the recovery and rehabilitation. So we have different clusters which were coordinated by different agencies, as it was highlighted and presented in the first presentation by the friend from Mercy Malaysia. And we managed a hospital in the camp, actually, which was a collaborative initiative with Mercy Malaysia, and we involved directly to run, because this camp was established population, like 1,000 populations. And the last war displacement and the disaster, both are very different settings, because the tsunami is very all the people have access to the needies and the victims to go and provide the support and the access here. But during the war, it was in order to ensure the national security, and then there are various concerns. The access is easy to ensure the support and to provide the assistance to the people in the camp. Even the people cannot go out of the zones established just after the war zone to another. This the camp facilities that was also immediately established, and they provided very basic facilities, and then there were a lot of requirements for the food, like immediate food, and then the materials, hygiene kits and all, which were provided. So collaborative action was a successful learning during the last war. And a lot of psychosocial requirements were identified, and we also arranged mental health and psychosocial support programs with the help of various organizations in that camp. And we coordinated aid like with other civil society medical camp during the recovery process, because in that zone for over a year, but slowly released to go back to their own villages and to settle in medical assistance. So we didn't have any hospital, and with the help of other organizations, and we set up support, and even we have in the recovery phase we reconstructed hospitals and provided facilities. Then rehabilitate with shelters and livelihood. Also the story that we right now, with the COVID-19 issue, like taking as a case, and comparing the learning from the past, like we are taking a role, like to responding relief and MHPSS, mental health and psychosocial support services. And as every one of us experiencing right now, people are in need, and economic requirements and income is a major issue, because when we take the story, we have around 8 million populations employed, where over 50% are not in a form of getting a permanent income. So providing relief support to the isolated children and families, which was initiated by us, and then we facilitated public education, as it was mentioned in the last presentation. The fake news and issue of like creating rumors is a major issue, which created tension among children. So we have taken that step and contacted medias and facilitated to give the sources, right sources to the media to publish. And we also involved in MHPSS via hotline facilities, because comparing those tsunami and then last war and right now COVID-19, this is in the previous thing, population, a kind of a separate population was affected. Rest of the population were okay, so they have the opportunity to go and help the people who are affected. But now during the lockdown, all were in an isolated situation. So even they have the resources, but they are unable to transfer the resources to the places. So places like homes, the centers, elders homes, and the care centers received from the foreign country, so they couldn't operate, and they have as formed the presidential sector and a kind of a national coordination mechanism for the CS also to channel the resources to centers. So we were kind of an active and supportive mechanism that we observed during right now. And we run a virtual platform for children to provide information. So we formed a national like children.lk, and then we started information to the participant network. So this is the comparison of the three different situations. So when we look at the tsunami situation, like over 30,000 confirmed deaths were reported, and then over 88,000, 8,089,175 people displaced, and then over 79,000 houses were damaged, and among in Sri Lanka we have around 25 districts. Out of 25 districts, almost big have the we have the coastal line, and then so half the country was affected. Time when they don't have and their asset, and they provided a shelter to live for over a period of year, and then people with multiple needs, and these also were in the war situation for over 2-3 years to the direct situation. So they had that issues also, so when they were resettled and in the camp. And now in the COVID-19 situation, almost all the populations, they were in lockdown, and now they are released since the situation is being improved. But anyhow, we are still in a fearful situation. So there is a fear, because earlier, as I said, a group, separate population, like a people's initiative, volunteers initiatives were there. Even the aid agencies have a shortage of resources or whatever. The people, they themselves arranged and they provided support. But right now, that is not possible because of the access issues and all.
Then is equal to then artery and vein gets collapsed, and then is equal to there is a heart attack. So that's why I told you that. So this type is equal to of the synonymity we have to establish that if the mechanism understood by doctor, then the seismologist
your mics. I request all the participants to mute their mics.
What is the mechanism which governing the Breaking is equal to of the rock material at what point of time, at what stress, and when and where. So this is equal to one thing that we have to do that. Prediction involves so many stages. It is anticipation. We know that the Himalayan zone is most
Request all the participants to mute their mics.
The earthquake is happening also. And we have justification that what is anticipation because seismotectonic settings.
Sir, I think there is a technical problem. Our host lost his connection. Please be there.
Huge is equal to earthquake area.
Hello.
Latur earthquake area. Jabalpur earthquake area.
Am I audible?
Getting my voice, sir?
Tectonics. There is no
The technical team is checking what's problem. So we request you to wait.
And causing is equal to causing the disaster is equal to
Some recording is
that there is equal to fluid is equal to the time of the movement of the Indian plate.
Yes, sir. We are looking into it.
So there is a lot of justification for that.
Okay, so can I speak? Can I continue?
There is reference to the without the
So can I continue?
Yes, sir.
Sir, please continue.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. These are and listed out how it was past in Sri Lanka, and tsunami was the main disaster. Tsunami was the major we faced. So with in every experience of disaster, immediately we were in a recovery phase, and we have made the arrangement for repatriation, and who have displaced also gone to their place, and depends on the incidences they faced. Mostly natural disaster was immediately arranged, and but for the rehabilitation and basic social functions were provided just after the relief support. So basically it was like providing protections and debriefing for responders and victims, and MHPSS, mental health and psychosocial support services. An issue in the psychosocial rehabilitation and assessment was need just after the disaster and during the relief. So in the recovery process, we considered mainly 4 major areas, like community recovery, like as a community they can rebuild their communities, considering the major needs, especially the psychosocial well-being and the basic need. So that we ensure the local support system. In each community's system is there, and then we strengthening those systems to provide the facilities and the needs to be refilled. And then infrastructure recoveries. Services especially the infrastructure facilities, and then economy recovery also, especially the financial needs of people and employment and their livelihood. So was a major needs when we considered in the early recovery process. And then there is a consideration for environmental recovery as well. Considering those made arrangement, and they have made changes and improvement in the policy level, and even they have improved number of systems. So can be learned as a case, how it was created and how it is useful right now to deal the current issue. reducing potential disaster like recovery and economy. The disaster management was established in Sri Lanka. Yeah, so that was a program initiated since 2017, and it's going up ending in this 2020. Sri Lanka Comprehensive Disaster Management Program to self in the incorporate the disaster management component, and then national policy and local government also identify the importance of MTP into the local level planning. And then the housing policy, because in Sri Lanka we have the different level of geographical, and then in the plantation sector in the up countries always the landslides were there, and then the secure housing arrangement were considered, and supporting initiatives were taken during the housing programs. And coastal management planning also process incorporate with DRR components, and then urban development planning process incorporate with disaster response, and then national and regional physical planning and policy identify the importance of DRR concerned in the spatial planning process, because in the country, even it is a central government, and there is a central government planning for the program, the regional and at the district level, but there is a arrangement, to respond immediately. So there are ensured in the country, and then climate also incorporating ERR into the climate. Yes. And preparation that we have ensured to maintain the development planning in Sri Lanka. So we have further development identify the importance of disasters, and as I said earlier, the district and regional plan the importance of risk resilience, sustainable development plan, and then post disaster reconstruction and incorporate DRR outcome, because considering the past incidences, we have mapping and we had an assessment plan. So based on that, the preparation was developed, and then there were bylaws prepared and presented to provincial councils. But these are the development disaster that natural disasters in the past. Anyhow, these and supporting arrangement that we in order to face the current situations right now. So the efforts to mainstream DRR, we have further arrangement development of hazard profiles. So the coastal erosion and then drop plots and landslides, lightning, and also so the different kind of preparations and mapping were done along with the cooperation of and connection with other service providers and stakeholders, and development of management centers. Each districts they have established under the ministry, and then at the because during the disaster in the past, even the natural disaster, mostly the children and women were affected. So have included in the curriculum give the knowledge to the children of the disaster preparedness and management, and then and have national courses. And this is also a new development in Singapore. We didn't have programs like even environmental programs we didn't have, which were initiated recently. Emergency relief and post-disaster damages and loss were insurance trust fund here, and mitigation and awareness were conducted to reduce the disaster and flood and landslide and all. So these are the additional key arrangements and initiatives done to the development and rehabilitation, which are very useful to us, and the organizers also to have a common plan. This development is very much to ensure the initiatives of each CVS or civil society organization. So this is the learning and the experience that we throughout the disasters in the past and the in best develop the system and the policies in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much. Hello.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving us an insight into your case, which was very informative. I request you to kindly wait for the question and answer session, which is scheduled at 7:50. So also instruction to the participants, I also request everyone to turn off their audio and your video. And also I request to put your questions in the question box, which will be answered during the question and answer session. Now let us move to the next part of the session. We have Dr. Chindu Sridharan. Dr. Chindu Sridharan is a principal academic in journalism at Bournemouth University, United Kingdom. His specialization is in crisis news, heading the coverage of the Kashmir conflict, the India-Pakistan Kargil war, and the Maoist insurgency in central India. He also holds PhD in journalism, which is in longitudinal analysis of the news media coverage of the Kashmir conflict. He also teaches for college students, doctoral students who are interested in journalism and crisis situations like terrorism, internal conflict, war and disaster, and also digital narrative and storytelling. Now I'd like to hand over the session to Dr. Chindu Sridharan.
So just to give you an idea of where I come in and what I do, I try to understand media behaves in disaster situations. Disaster situations could mean anything from a conflict war, or it could be a disasters that could be natural disasters as well, like or a flood, etc. So I do the news and I would understand that face these challenges. I want to make case for two points that we both have to be thinking about. There's a very much more broadly, more expansive than we've been thinking about. And the second point is also connected. It's the fact, or it is the argument that there's a need for news media resilience to disasters, that news media organizations, journalists, they need to be thinking about disasters differently. They need to be prepared for disasters than they have so far. So I want to start off with a quote that underpins approach to disaster journalism. So your media has got a huge and positive role to play for the betterment of an affected society. But the problem is that sometimes when journalists are close to a disaster, when they're actually reporting on a disaster, they're kind of caught up in that world. And it's quite easy forgotten how important the role that they're actually playing. A role that they're playing there. Because is that a disaster is not an ordinary, it's not ordinary times, and it's not ordinary journalism we are doing at that point of time, journalists. So this is what I would call extraordinary journalism in extraordinary times. And why is that so important? Because the news media is the main way in which the society experiences a disaster most of the time. So at this point, the news media journalists have got an extended role to play, and that particular is not just as an objective observer, but what we have to keep in mind is that disasters are not just physical or medical emergencies. Disasters are crucially communication emergencies as well, and the clarity of communication in the response phase, in the recovery phase, or in the rebuilding phase. This is very, very crucial to how that disaster will play out, and the kind of mitigation role and the risk reduction rules that society can implement. So again, just before we go ahead, I just want to clarify what I mean by disaster journalism, just to give us some clarity in terminology. And one good way of thinking about disaster journalism is as a process of gathering and presenting news and information pertaining to any kind of disaster, whether it's natural or human-induced, that occurred, are occurring, or important thing is that all occur or may occur in future. So, if we were to look at disaster journalism cycle, so this is how the journalism cycle could play out essentially. So there is disaster event, which you can see on the lower part. So there is a disaster event, and normally news media plays a great role at that part, particularly a great deal of reporting. So there is breaking news, there is a reportage on what happened or what is happening. There's a great information, and there's a lot of misinformation as well at that point of time. And then this phase here, which is reporting, or which go to more, I would say. In this particular section or cycle of disaster journalism, we have the purpose of the news media, or the responsibility of the news media, is to report or provide journalism that will help the community to recover from the disaster. And then the next phase is that the community disaster mitigation and preparedness. So essentially, this is the mitigation phase. Mitigation phase where the journalists are expected to.
I request all the participants to kindly mute their mic. It is causing problem for the presenter. Kindly, please.
And go on. So there is this particular phase wherein one of the main responsibility of the journalist is actually to play their watchdog role. It's about to scrutinize what's been happening, the disaster policies, what kind of plannings are being put in place, etc., etc. Then next phase is actually, it kind of loops back, a pre-disaster, a pre-crisis stage, wherein the main purpose of the journalist is to provide disaster warnings, providing what kind of precautionary measures that people should be taking, etc. And then we have the disaster, and the cycle goes on. So this is the way that it ought to play out, actually. So it's a good depiction of it. It's not quite what really happens during disaster situation. So what happens is that much of disaster journalism take place just before, during, immediately after the incident. Okay, and much of our journalism is about providing disaster warnings to the community. It's about informing developments as the disaster unfolds. So there's a reason for that also, and because disasters are disaster news is purest definition of news. It's quite immediate, it's visual, and it's filled with emotion, and as such, it kind of fulfills pretty much all the news values by which journalists provide, and hence there's a lot of coverage due for the immediate phase of disaster. And why is this also important? I think, again, just to explain why news media behaves in this particular manner, it's the reason is news is, how do we define news? News is actually about something new. So we have this saying in journalism: if it bleeds, it leads. And disasters over time, disasters are emotional. There's a lot of body counts quite often, and hence there's a lot of attention. But as soon as that initial phase is over, media attention often wanders away. It goes back, and there's a reason for this. One of the reasons why news media attention becomes sparse over a few weeks after the incident, for instance, is that the disaster communities or the disaster affected news organizations within a local community, they do not have the resources to do recovery stories and follow up. There are quite often, like it happened in the Nepal earthquake situation, they're quite often not just journalists, they're actually survivors as well. So they're survivor journalists, they've been deeply affected themselves. So then there is also the question of disaster fatigue. The community that's affected, it's, people might not be wanting to read disaster stories every day. So they might be wanting to move away from that as well. But there's a much more fundamental problem here that kind of explains why journalism quickly moves away from a disaster and gets on with other stories. And that's the problem of the way that we think about disasters. It's a problem with the way that we define and understand disasters. It's like I was saying, it's a problem with the way that we define and understand disasters, because disasters are normally seen as events, but the important thing is that disasters, an event is normally a trigger of the disaster. It's one in a series of a chain of events. So the whole spread city then that was it. So disasters are other systems that we need to single event. Okay? They can be for us understanding this. Why is it important to be thinking about it? Because one level one. Especially the ability of journalists to put on disasters, it compromises disaster the recovery and rebuilding. Given this crucial role that the news media has to play in this situation, I want to take a quick look at 3 disasters that we are all aware of to make some general observations about where we stand in terms of news media preparedness and resilience. So the first one I want to have a quick look at is the Nepal earthquake again in 2015. All of us are aware of that iconic scene that. And I'm drawing here from some research, what we've done on disaster preparedness in Nepal after the earthquake. And as you well know, Nepal is a country Nepal is a nation that's prone to disasters. I think roughly more than 500 plus disasters occur in Nepal every year. Yet when the earthquake came, despite the fact that there were warnings around these things, the country was quite. And I think that sort of that. So news media itself was for limited computers because our newsroom was not, and we were shifted to a camp. They were actually working from tents and on the same computer. The copy editors would edit copy. There were reporters who were standing to write the news, so they were actually queuing up to write news. And on the same computer, they would sit sign paper. It is very hard. So that kind of gives us an idea of how journalists coped with that disaster. They did a good job in some senses because they all came together to help each other out after the disaster, but there wasn't real planning to any kind of for overcoming that disaster. Whatever happened and the way that they coped was quite ad hoc in that manner. And 5 years down the line, when we look back at Nepal, the important thing that we want to notice, and we've been working in Nepal again because of the COVID situation, the country still, not just this country, the Nepali journalism organizations and still are quite ill prepared despite having a major disaster quite recently. The country is still underprepared to take on disasters. Now, the second issue that, or a case study, let's put it that way, that I want to take a look at is the issue of what I would call a human rights crisis, a humanitarian disaster that has been unfolding in India for years, and that's the issue of rape and sexual violence and the way that the news media reports on that. Now, this particular issue is not peculiar to India, but India, as you know, has a high number of sexual violence, and we as a nation began to accept it, acknowledge it, I would say, as a disaster in waiting only recently, only after the repair, I would think. And of course, the news media has a huge and impactful role in this crisis as well. So we've done some work on it, and I wanted to draw on a study that my colleague Prabhana Postan and I together with UNESCO, which looks to understand the journalism surrounding rape and sexual violence, this particular humanitarian. And our study is based on a large content analysis of 10 newspapers in 6 languages over 3 months, and also interviews with about 257 journalists in about 14 languages. And I wanted to provide a quick look at some of the that we are about to publish. So again, some of the issues that that we found with the way that news media rape in India. So there is a severe, we know that we are underreporting of rape itself, but within the news reporting of rape, there's severe underreporting of marital rape. There is a severe underreporting of acquaintance rape, that is normally news reports present rape as something that's done to strangers rather than someone that the victim or the survivor might actually know. Newspapers, again, it's not a surprising finding, but newspapers were mainly concerned with rape in urban areas. So rape that occurs in rural areas, rape that occurs outside the city limits, that are underreported again. And crucially, that's the last 2 points that are very interesting. 28% of women journalists had personal experience of sexual harassment or violence in journalism environments in their work area, whether it's been newsrooms or whether they were, or while they were trying to report on sexual violence in the field. And another 39%, close to 40%, knew of sexual violence or harassment in the news environment, in their work areas, actually. So we have some major concerns with the way, the mechanism that we rely on to keep the society informed about rape and sexual violence, and hold power to account at the way that the news media functions itself in terms of the journalism of rape. So, and now the last kind of that the situation that I want to draw your attention is to the current crisis of communication around the COVID-19 situation. So it's fair to say that all countries woke up to this disaster quite late. UK, where I live, treated it with hubris, I would say, in the initial phase, and paid for that with nearly 44,602 lives as of now. And probably it's more than that, but that's the official figures. And in India too actually woke up to the disaster much later than it should have. It kind of wasted the pre-crisis pre-crisis stage, and it seems to be handling the situation really, really badly at this point of time. The only exception being, of course, the state of Kerala, which showed a memorable proactiveness and engagement of civil society Even before the first case was reported, it was actually working to prevent this. So, what role does the news media play in all this? So the important questions that we can ask here actually. So what role is the news media playing in this particular crisis currently? To what extent has it held the governments to account? When did its coverage start? And what's the quality of that coverage? So when we ask these questions, I think the answers that we get are quite disappointing. Find that the coverage started quite late. The coverage often happened at often crisis situations. It was quite led by politics. There's an interesting model called PMP model, which is politics, media, politics model. And that's kind of the media is be following that particular path, which is not particularly productive or healthy when you are dealing with disasters. So essentially, I have outlined 3 kinds of disasters: one a natural, a humanitarian disaster. I'm sorry?
No, sir. Carry on, sir. Carry on.
Okay. So I have outlined 3 kinds of disaster: a humanitarian disaster, a natural disaster, and of course, a matter that we're all living in together. And if you look at these disasters, you see there are some common trends across these ones. Number one, the kind of reporting that was done on all these disasters, you'll find that it's episodic, it's spot stories, it's what's happening right now. And the coverage often we again find begins quite late, often wasting the pre-crisis stage, not used to prepare the community for disaster, taking preparatory measures, etc. There is less energy spent on interrogation of disaster. So to hold governments to account and question and scrutinize them, it will put actually most of their effort is actually covering events, covering spot stories, I was saying. And probably is now is because of the kind of preparedness that news media have in reporting this disaster. I think the problem, I would say, is because news media treats a disaster, which I would argue is not a normal situation, but an extraordinary situation, the same kind of operationality and the same kind of values which it uses for ordinary times. So the kind of news values that we would apply and the way that we would function in a normal situation is being applied to an extraordinary situation. So the sensitivities are the same. The level of responsibility is also the same, and then therein we have a problem. And therein lies the main problem. So when we speak about news media preparedness and news media resilience, normally we end up speaking about the physical safety aspects of journalists. So these are the kind of issues that we normally discuss when we speak about preparedness. One is the question of physical safety itself. It is quite fundamental and quite important, of course, because primary concern is the reporters, the journalists, the news organizations, physical safety, as whether it's the PPE or to make sure that the journalists are safe and protected. That is quite important, but this shouldn't be, the discussion should move beyond that. So then again, we speak about damage to infrastructure, and of course we speak about, now these days, at least in the recent years, we have begun to speak about trauma and mental well-being of the reporters while they are covering disasters. But I think this conversation needs to move much beyond that. I think there is reason, it's important that we also speak beyond the physical safety measures and speak about editorial resilience and editorial preparedness to better equip journalists for covering disasters. So resilience, it's a process by which individuals are able to positively adapt to substantial difficulties, adversity or hardship. That's a good way of thinking about it. So resilience is all about getting an outcome, getting a positive outcome in the face of adversity. And resilience is made possible by developing certain competencies, developing certain capacities, developing the certain strengths. And the important thing that we need to remember when we speak about it, resilience, is probably the fact that it's not one thing. It's not by doing one thing that you become suddenly resilient. It's just a series of things that you have to do, and it's never developed overnight. But it's actually needs to be seen as a process. That's what we need to keep in mind. And when we try and how do we apply this to news organizations so that they are resilient, they are better prepared to report in disasters, and crucially, by doing that, they're able to serve their societies better. Again, when we ask that question, it's quite often boils down to the idea, of course, that actually there is a lot of money involved in it. And news organizations might not always have that kind of money, especially in Asia, in Nepal, for instance, or even in India, for that matter. But actually, I sort of want to differ from that, because it's not just about cost. Editorial resilience is not all about money or lack thereof. It's also about thinking, changing the way that we think. It's about editorial strategies and policies. It's about having contingency plans in place, and importantly, it's about acquiring a familiarity and the competence to implement these editorial measures and strategies across a disaster cycle, so that the effective it's a thinking as well. It's not just about money. It's about finding different ways of working. It's about finding different kinds of solutions. It's about reporting about solutions as well. It's about asking different kinds of questions. It's about maybe putting aside the competitiveness of journalists to one side and collaborating during the disaster cycle. So it's quite a lot. It's about actually rethinking the way that we think about journalists. So what kind of editorial measures? I'm just about to conclude, guys. I know that I might be running a little over time. Let's look at some of these editorial measures that journalists could implement. So, of course, the question and professional operational contingency plans, so making sure that there are stages well before the disaster, so that disaster, there's a plan in place for this. About establishing redundancy locations for newsrooms. For instance, in the Nepal situation, so a lot of the newsrooms were completely, they didn't have a place to work from. So when you have thinking and putting in place, okay, fine, this happens, so where do we actually publish our stories? We'll to X location or Y location. So, and important, again, the third point is crucial. I think it's about having regulations within news organizations, within media houses about the government's disaster policies and interrogating that. Okay? Is actually scrutinized. They're questioned about the policies or the lack thereof. It's also risk mitigation. Might be collaborating with other news organizations so that you can come together during a disaster situation. It's about training, building capacity for specific of training. It could be about physical training, but it needs to go beyond that as well. It could be about establishing peer support networks for journalists. They can help each other. For me, the two points that drive that won't be underlined is good disaster journalism is made to last by preparedness. And editorial preparedness needs to be more expansive. We need to be thinking much more expansively about disasters. We need to be thinking about disasters not just as a single event, but as complex systems that are quite interconnected. In preparedness, in the physical and structural state that normally for conversation. And we need to be thinking about it not just in the disaster. It's not one of it. It needs to be process which involves continual actors. It needs to stress disaster events to effect risk reduction and overall bring together or strengthen the news resilience to tackle any disasters. Okay, thank you for that. I'll stop there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your detailed information on journalism in the time of disaster, and also for sharing your findings of your surveys. It was very informative. Now let us move on to the question answer session. Before that, I would like to request the participants to kindly put up your questions in the question box and not to unmute yourselves. There a question for Chindu, sir. Hello, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. So, media is the first time information provided to the public. Is there any single window system of data information available at the national, state, and district level, which is more trustworthy?
If people have national disaster management policies, and they have disaster bodies as well. And I guess this is one of the areas where you have to, what you would call the official numbers, etc. You would be able to get. So it's a difficult question for me to answer looking across. Which country are we speaking about? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
So you could take India as an example.
Is it more trustworthy or less trustworthy? What's the question again? Could you repeat that?
Most trustworthy.
I am not very sure whether any government figures is where it's a starting point. Any national figures, that's what you start with really. But of course, journalists should be looking beyond that. It's always in the interest of bodies to be not even possible for the governmental bodies to accurate figures. We need to be interrogating every bit of information that you would be getting, I would say. Point. Just and making figures up or etc. Be using that as a basic starting point, and then should be looking at it more closely. Oops.
Okay, so thank you for it. Also, I have another question for you. How do we ensure that journalists are competent to understand disaster as a subject or set a trial or error process? How can journalists and technocrats collaborate to bring a change during the crisis time?
Excellent question. Interesting question. Yes, I think one of the things that we don't have in most countries, in India, especially in Nepal, definitely, but also in the Western nations, it is also about the training actually. Okay? The training needs to, the kind of training that we provide needs to improve. Right now, pretty much everywhere, the kind of disaster training that's provided to journalists is limited to their physical safety. It's about risk assessment. It's about what you should do, whether you should be interviewing sensitively. It's to some extent it's about trauma and how to overcome that, etc. But the kind of training that I'm speaking about is rarely seen. It's about actually thinking about disasters much more broadly and expansively. It's about changing our journalism curriculum so that it's actually embedded in that. It's about having quite a persistent training for journalism within journalism organization also. So all those things need to be put in place, and it's not going to happen overnight, but it's something that we need to be working towards. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sir, I have a question for Mr. Mayuran. I think he is online. Hello, sir. Hello.
This.
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so what was done with those
Yeah, hello.
suffering from serious... Sir, hello.
Yes.
Sir, the question is, in your case, for example...
I hear you, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, for example, in your case in Sri Lanka, what was done with those suffering from serious post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah, it's a very relevant that we have faced during the war, especially in 2009, like. So in the last war, like, you know, which has started in 2005 to 2009, we identified many PTSD, you know, many patients with PTSDs, and especially among the children. So we have started a special program which is attached to the National Institute of Mental Health in Sri Lanka. So the ministries have their own centers in the hospitals, and they have formed a group called multidisciplinary resource team. So it is a team with relaxation experts and occupational therapists, and then various therapeutic personalities and psychiatric social workers, a team combined with that, and then they have done an assessment with service users, the clients, and their identify their requirements, and they have done a development plan, a rehabilitation plan for the service users, and they implemented collaboratively. So the collaborative action is the key to provide the service to the people who are affected with PTSD. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Due to time constraint, we are stopping with this question and answer session. Also, to conclude, I would like to thank very much for Mr. Mayuran and Dr. Chinju Sridharan for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. I hope this session has been very informative to all the students, professionals, lecturers who have attended this program. So, speaking about tomorrow, we have eminent speakers from NIDM, namely Mr. Raju Thapa, who will speak on Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, SDGs, and climate change adaptation. And Mr. Anil Kahai will speak on the Prime Minister's 10-point agenda and National Disaster Management Plan guidelines. We also have a dialogue with Mr. Sunny Hofihi and Dr. Prince Solomon, who will talk on the effects of crisis and disaster on the vulnerable groups in Nigeria and India respectively. And also, for your kind information of the participants, for those who are watching the program live on YouTube, please fill the attendance sheet which is being put in the comment section. And also for those watching it in Cisco Webex web, you need not worry about your attendance, it is automatically generated. So thank you and have a nice day.